So we're in the book of Malachi. If you've got a Bible app, you can open up to Malachi. Or if you have a Bible, you can open up there. If you don't own a Bible, we do have free Bibles in the back. They're the blue ones. You can snag one of those on the way out. We are in Malachi chapter 2. We're going to be starting in verse 10. And I want to recap where we've been over the last handful of weeks. So we're looking at this book of Malachi, and in the historical story of the nation of Israel, God has these chosen people, the nation of Israel, who are to represent him to the world and draw people to himself through their representation of who he is. And these people have wandered away from God's direction. So God brought them into a land called Babylon in exile, and then he brings them back out of exile. And you would think after this punishment of being brought out of their homeland and then being brought back, they'd be like, okay, now we get it. And they don't get it. And so we see God send Malachi to continue to offer them direction and clarity for how they are to live. And right there, somebody might say, how is Malachi relevant to my life? Like, there it is, right? All of us struggle to pursue the way of God. And so there's a lot we can glean from this book in direct application and also in that, let's not do that. Let's do some things different. And we've talked about some themes like spiritual blindness. We talked about the theme of giving God our leftovers and not giving him our best. And we just ended this last section last week with God's correction of the people by saying to the religious leaders, you guys are playing favorites. You're giving more sway to some people than to others, and that's not the way it should be. So as we enter into Malachi chapter 2, that's the backdrop. Chapter 2, verse 10 to 17. Let me read all these verses, and then we're going to go back and break them down a little bit. So, verse 10 says, do we not all have one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we profane the covenant of our ancestors by being unfaithful to one another? Judah has been unfaithful. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. As for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord remove him from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty. Another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer looks with favor on your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. You ask, why is it, or why? It is because the Lord is the witness between you and the wife of your youth. You have been unfaithful to her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. Has not the one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. The man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect, says the Lord Almighty. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful. You have wearied the Lord with your words. How have we wearied him, you ask? By saying all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord, and he is pleased with them. Or, where is the God of justice? So again, a strong word from Malachi. And we can glean truth out of this if we're open to what God wants to teach us in this passage. In the next few weeks, God starts to pivot. He starts to pivot out of this corrective language into a language that still has correction, but he's also saying, but here's what I promised I would do, and I will continue to fulfill my promise. I will continue to do what I said I'm going to do, which is to bring hope and redemption to you. So let's continue on the early journey of the book of Malachi. And next week, we'll pivot into him bringing us the reminder of his goodness. So it says, verse 10, do we not all have one Father? Did not one God create us? That's an appeal to what we read last week, which was that God was accusing these people of playing favorites. And so he basically says, look, you shouldn't be playing favorites. We're all one from one God. We all have one Father who made us. And then he says, why do we profane the covenant of our ancestors by being unfaithful to one another? This is God saying, you're playing favorites and you shouldn't do so. You should be faithful to one another with what you say. If God says do X, you should do X. And if you say to someone, I will engage with you this way, you should do it. This unfaithfulness right here is just a picture of the fact that the people are doing as they please and they're doing whatever will be an advantage to them. We are called to be God's people, so we're to be faithful to one another. And in a very directly applicable way, this is God correcting them because he's saying, you're failing to keep your commitments. You're failing to keep your commitments. You said you would do X, but you're not doing it, and that's not what I want you to be like. And so there's the application for us. Jesus says the same thing in Matthew chapter 5. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. So one verse in, here's the application for us. Can you be trusted to do what you say you're going to do? Are you a person of your word? I do think it's interesting later on when we read in the Gospels, Jesus says, don't swear by heaven or by earth, but let your yes be yes and your no be no. It's like Jesus is saying, you shouldn't have to say something like, I swear to God, I'll do it. He says, like, just do what you say you're going to do. Let me give you two applications broadly for this one, okay? One is, okay, and I'm going to poke the bear here a little bit, okay? If you're a person who resonates with what I say, then just let you like experience it, process it, and then you can talk to God about it. If you're a person on the other side, don't poke anybody around you or nudge your neighbor, okay? Just listen to it. Part of being true to our word and letting our yes be yes is being where we are supposed to be when we're supposed to be there. It's called timeliness. You see why I said don't poke anybody? Because we could probably break the room into 50%, right? Those of us who struggle to be on time and those of us who struggle to be gracious with those who struggle to be on time, right? But that's a yes being yes thing. It's one thing to be like, I'll meet you there and to not show up at all. It's very clear that we're like either something happened, they're just blowing me off or they forgot. But timeliness is an example of letting your yes be yes because it's someone saying, I will do X, I will be here at a certain time. And when I'm not, it makes me say, can I trust that person? Are they a person of integrity, a person of their word? Now you might hear that and go like, wow, that's just like a small example. But if you add up the number of times that you or I are late to a meeting or an appointment, and you add that up in a lifetime, you've probably robbed hours and hours and hours from people. Now, again, you can hear that and go like, oh, it's not a big deal. But oftentimes in the life of faith, it's not the wielding of the spiritual sword that kills us. It's 10,000 paper cuts, right? If I start like not keeping my word here and I don't keep it here and I don't keep it here and I don't keep it here, it adds up and it impacts us. So there's a simple example like let your yes be yes. Again, I ask you the question, can you be trusted to do what you say you'll do? Because these religious leaders and the people were not able to be trusted. They said one thing and they do another thing. We don't want to be like that. I was thinking about this topic of trustworthiness, and what came to mind was that many of you know Karen and Michael Green. They've been part of our launch team and our lead team here at the church. Karen and I worked for many years in student ministry and with young adults together, and through that, Jenny and Michael and Karen and I we've had a long friendship. And so at one point, we had something going on with the kids at school, and you had to sign the paper to say, you know, if you're out and we can't contact you and something happens with your kid, who do you want to contact? And so we texted Karen and said, hey, can we put you down as the emergency contact list in case something happens to us? Now this in our mind was kind of like, you know, in case we're out and our phones aren't working, whatever, but it could be something terribly tragic. Would you step in and pick the kids up from school? Her response was, I would love those children like my own. That's a word of trust right there, right? When someone says, if something happens to you, we will take care of your children. That's trust, right? And so let me just ask you this question again. The issue here is that the appeal at the beginning is like, we have one Father, there's one God who created us, so don't be unfaithful to the covenants you make, to the promises you make. And so I ask again, are you a person who's trustworthy? And if that like hits you, if you're like, ooh, preacher, stop. Like, we're all guilty of this in some way, right? But how can you grow? How can you organize your life so that you will be a person who is more and more and more trustworthy? All right, let's continue on. Verse 11 says, Judah has been unfaithful. Judah is another way of describing this nation of Israel. It says, a detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary of the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. I want you to see the language there. It's a language of unfaithfulness, which we saw up in the first verse 10 as well. And then it says detestable, which is a really strong word. I would say that when I shared some of the pictures of me holding this anaconda, people thought it was detestable. The response was not like, I'm neutral on that. It was like, nope, never, don't, just get that death noodle away from me. I mean, it was strong, right? So like detestable is a really strong word. And when we talk about committed, like it's interesting, we're talking about faithfulness. We would say people should be committed to one another, but they carried out something that's detestable. And we say, what is that? And he says, you have married women who worship a foreign god. This is really, I think, the central idea to this text, which is that in particular, the men of this time of the nation of Israel were bailing on their wives and marrying foreign women. Now, there's a variety of issues that'll be talked about in this text, but the big picture here is that God says, I want you to be my faithful covenant people. And to do that, I don't want you to marry foreign women. And you might say, so God is xenophobic, but that's not the case. What's happening here is that when God sees when these men marry women who worship foreign gods, these men often bail on God and start worshiping these foreign gods. So in light of that, God's saying, this is a detestable thing because I know your hearts, you're so fickle, you're going to run to these other gods if you start marrying these other women. Pause for 1 second. I'm getting a little like hum are you guys hearing this? Can we adjust that in the back at all? That'd be awesome. Feels like every time I speak, there's an angel going, oh, 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 oh. So, that's the level of my singing, by the way. It's the best you're going to get. So, all right. Thank you, friend. There's this intermarriage is the issue. And this idea actually carries forward to the New Testament as well, where Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, he talks about if you're married to someone and then this person dies, you're allowed to remarry. And then he says this one little line. He says, as long as you are in the Lord. And it's the same concept again, right? So now listen, I'm going to go into a little depth about how this applies to our life today. But here's the big picture, which we all know instinctively, and God is just saying it explicitly, which is that if we choose to partner with anybody in anything, not even just marriage, but anything, and that person sees the world significantly different than we do, that is going to be a challenge, right? Just think about, like in a partnership, let's talk about marriage or dating. What if two people view money really differently? Does it mean that they can compromise? Probably. But if you have someone who's a miser and someone who's a shopaholic, that immediately is going to bring tension because they have two different views of how to handle cash, right? And so Malachi is saying the same thing here. For God, he's saying, don't intermarry with these foreign nations because they're going to say, follow these gods and do these things when you're supposed to follow the one true God. And so Malachi is like, why are you doing that? I told you not to do it. Again, we'll see more about the way they've carried this out. But let's be clear here. This is not just an option of like, well, here's one God and here's another God. Pick which one you like. There is one true God, and all the other gods are made up. This is the fact and the truth of Scripture and the fact of common sense. That when we look at the world, we say, okay, if I say God is X and you say God is Y, they are not the same thing. And so if somebody says God is Molech and somebody says, no, God is Yahweh, I can't stand in the middle and to go, they're the same thing because they're clearly not. So in light of that, God is saying, don't worship false gods. And P.S., these false gods, in the minds of the people, demanded often horrendous activities. So I did a little research. I had known some of this in the past, but I wanted to dig deeper into this. But for example, you have Molech, sometimes referred to as Baal. And one of the things they did was they sacrificed their firstborn children to Molech. And the process was this massive statue of this god with, in its kind of chest area, a massive fire that would heat up these massive hands, and they would just place an infant on these massive hands as a sacrifice to this god. And that was not a rare thing. And so when you think about that, it's not just like, well, it's one or the other. It's darkness and light. It's evil and it's good. And God is saying, if you intermarry, you're going to get drawn away to that. So why are you doing this? You can see why God feels strongly about it, because it's not just like, well, it's a preference thing. You like vanilla, I like chocolate. No, it's like, you like life or do you want death? And so he says, you have desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying women who worship a foreign god. Verse 12, as for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord remove him from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty. So God says, if you're one of the men who's doing this, the desire that Malachi is expressing is that you'd be cut off from God. We saw this, if you remember last week, we talked about this idea of when they took the innards of an animal after they sacrificed it, they would take it outside the camp to get rid of it. They would isolate it, take it away. And in the same way, God is saying, if you continue this way, you're going to be cut off and left outside the camp. And that just brought to my mind the question, do we take sin that seriously? Like, do I look at the things that I do in my life that are not aligning with God, that are aligning with wrongness or darkness, and do I go, to err is human? Or do I look at them and say, God's drawn a line and said, this is the way to live, this is not the way to live. And when you engage in this, it's darkness. And so we must eliminate the darkness and move toward light. I had a friend years ago who was struggling with sin. And at one point, he came to me and he's like, what do I need to do to eliminate this sin from my life? And the reason I know what I said is because it just like exploded out of me and he wrote it down. And then he's like, do you remember when you said this? And I was like, I don't. But he showed me years later. And when he said that to me, I just said to him, kill it, kill it, kill it. Do whatever it takes to eliminate that from your life. And so if sin is viewed so seriously that God's like, I don't know why you're intermarrying. I don't know why you're bailing on this covenant you made with your wife to intermarry with these other women. Stop it or you'll be cut off. Again, the question I ask is, do we take sin that seriously? And the reason, again, is not just God saying, hey, you're being naughty, is he's saying, I've made a covenant with you. This whole book starts with these words. I have loved you. And so God's like, I want to love you, but you keep running away from me. I want to love you, but instead of loving the things that we agreed upon, you're loving darkness. So don't do that, he's saying. He's trying to draw the people back to himself. And he says, there are consequences if you don't follow in the ways of God. It continues on, verse 13. Another thing you do. Okay, the list just continues. You flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer looks with favor on your offering or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. I just wrote next to another thing. I just circled and wrote, wow. I mean, the list is just like going on and going on, you know. Can you imagine Malachi shows up? He's like, thus saith the Lord. And he starts laying it out. And then he's like, keeps going. And they're like, ooh. And he just keeps going. And then he's like, another thing. And you're like, my gosh. He's just laying everything out that he sees them doing, right? And he says, you flood the Lord's altars with tears because he no longer looks with favor on your offerings. So here's the picture, is that the people are going to the altar, making sacrifices, and they're not receiving blessing from God, and so they're crying. I don't know if you remember, in one of the earlier sermons, I used the term childish, describing some of the behavior. This is the exact same thing. Like, here's the analogy, right? A brother and a sister, or two sisters, right? Let's say one sister smacks the other sister. That sister starts crying. The parent says to the child who struck the other one, that's it, you lost your allowance. And the first kid starts crying. And you say, what are you crying about? And the kid says, I lost my allowance. And the parent says, you're missing it. What you should be crying about is that you hurt somebody, but you're just sad that you lost out on something. And that's what's happening here. The people are bringing their sacrifice and say, here's our sacrifice, God. And God's like, I'm not blessing it. And they're like, wah. I mean, it says, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and you wail. I mean, that's strong language. They're like, oh, God, why? And God's like, do you see what you're doing here? I mean, it is such a childish response. Like, God, I want you to do this thing for me. And God's like, well, why are you not living rightly? And they're like, don't worry about that. Please do this thing for me. And if you don't, I'm going to cry about it, right? Again, I think the word childish fits here. You smack your sister, you get your allowance taken away, and now you're upset that your allowance is taken away. You're missing the point that this is what led to that, right? And so they're totally missing it. They're weeping and they're wailing. Let me just note something here for us to be aware of. That clearly this book and various books throughout the scripture, if not all of them, express emotion in the Bible. Sometimes Western Christians in America, the North America area, we can kind of be like, well, it's not about your emotions, it's about the facts. It is about the facts, but it's also about the emotions. God has made us complete people where we use our brain and we use our heart, right? We got emotions and we have cognitive processes. But let's also see here that you can have deep emotions and they can be totally misled. It's really important, right? So the facts of the situation here say you're weeping and wailing, but you're totally missing the point. Now, on the other side that we can run towards just information, there are some circles where people can be so caught up in emotion connected to church that if there's deep emotion, the conclusion is, therefore, it's true. You can have deep emotions and be totally off the rails. Because these guys are crying. They're not just crying, they are weeping and wailing. And the description is you flood the Lord's altar with tears. And just because they feel emotional, God's not like, well, it's okay. He's like, it doesn't matter how much you cry, you've done it incorrectly. So let's be cautious that when we engage in our spiritual walk, we need to bring these two things together. Our thinking and our feeling. Our brains and our emotions. Those things go together. Right here, they're having all emotion and not thinking about the reason that God is not blessing them anymore. Here's what I wrote down. I think this is an important question that we see throughout this book. But I wrote down, they're weeping and wailing because God isn't blessing. He's not doing something for them, right? And so I just wrote down this question for us to consider. Do we say more of God, what can you do for me? Or do we ask, who are you to me? What can you do for me? Or who are you to me? One is transactional and one is relational. And in this example, in this verse, it's all about transaction. We do this, we want blessing, we're not getting it, we cry. And they're missing out the fact that they have broken the relationship with God. And so again, we should ask that of ourselves. When I come to God, am I turning God into, God, here's the deal, I want you to do things for me? Or am I saying, God, this is who you are to me. I want to be in relationship with you. And what comes out of that as far as transaction, that's secondary. But first, I want to be in relationship with you. He continues on. You ask, why? It is because the Lord is the witness between you and the wife of your youth. You've been unfaithful to her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. God says he's a witness to what's going on here. Within the historical context, it seems primarily what is happening is that the men who have more power in the culture and have the ability to divorce quickly are being flippant about the relationship they made with their wife. And they're saying, hey, this Babylonian woman is more attractive than you, and so I'm done, I'm running off with her. It's this attitude of just breaking the covenant because, well, I'm kind of more interested in her. This section talks about this topic of divorce, and we don't have the time to delve into all the subtlety and nuance and the hard realities of the topic of divorce. But as I looked at this, I thought to myself, probably most of us will agree that if you are in a relationship and your response is, I'm done with you because I think she's hotter, that's a problem. And that's exactly what these guys were doing. I'm not interested in you anymore. I'm interested in her. See ya. And they walk off. And God's like, why? I've been witness between you and the wife of your youth. You've been unfaithful to her, even though she's your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. Here's a takeaway for us. God takes marriage very seriously. He is not flippant about it. And while we go into the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we see grounds for the dissolution of a marriage or divorce, when we are flippant in that process, God is grieved. Again, it's them saying like, hey, I was at X, Y, and Z job, and then I bumped into this Babylonian woman, and I kind of like her more than you, so we're done, I'm running off with her. And God's like, you cannot do that. And that's why he uses this term unfaithful again and again and again and again. Now let me pause here from the Old Testament and take us to just a thought from the New Testament, which is this. Marriage is given as a gift to us as humans. But before it's a gift to us as humans, it is primarily a picture of God's faithfulness to his people. Right? When you ask most people, you say, why did God give us marriage? They go back to Genesis and they say, well, God said it's not good for man to be alone. And so he gave him woman. That is true. But the eternal reality of marriage, according to the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians, he says, there's a mystery in marriage. It's painting a picture of Christ and his faithful love to the church. And so the bride and the groom paint a picture to the world of this is what God's love is like. And so if that's true, then we look here and we go, man, when you just turn your back and bail on people, the world at large is watching and going, I guess that's what God's people do. And so I guess that's what God is like. When things get hard or things get more interesting somewhere else, God's going to run off and leave you high and dry, which in this story, we've already seen that is not the case. God's like, I made a promise. I'm going to keep my promise. Despite the fact that you guys are messing up all the time, I'm still going to be faithful. And these men are painting a picture to the culture they're around and the culture at large to say, we don't care about our covenants, and therefore God doesn't either. And God is grieved by that because he's being represented terribly by these people. God takes marriage very seriously. And again, in the context of here, he brings the pointed finger directly towards the men of this time. That's so uncomfortable, but it is so important that we engage with this reality. Continuing on. 15, has not the one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful, again, to the wife of your youth. Verse 15 starts as this, has not the one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. Okay, we're going to get a little bit below the surface here, so I'm glad the kids are upstairs. But this is a picture of God saying, my relationship with you, humans, the nation of Israel in particular, is all-encompassing. It's not just I want your soul, it's I got your body, I got your spirit. The whole thing is mine, and you are engaged with me in that way. And then he goes on to basically say, and what does one God seek? Godly offspring. Okay, so when a boy and a girl like each other very much, I mean, he's what he's talking about. He says godly offspring, right? And so he's like, I want all of you, Israel. And the picture is in a marriage that you are giving all of yourself, body, soul, and spirit, to the other person. And often the result is offspring. And so he's saying, I want you to stay in a covenant relationship with me so we can raise up another generation of people who will love and serve me. And he says, but you're not doing that. So be on guard. Don't be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. There's like a double meaning here. One is literally, don't just bail on your wife. The other meaning is, hey, we've been in this covenant relationship. Don't bail on me. It says the man, verse 16, the man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect, says the Lord Almighty. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful. The same line in verses 15 and 16. Be on guard. Don't be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. The language he uses, the man who hates and divorces his wife is what? Does violence. Now, it's so interesting to me because like hating and divorcing, most people would not say, they would say maybe it's mean or unkind, but it's violence. I mean, that's how strongly he feels about this flippant attitude that these men are having. You do violence to the one you should protect. Again, I want to be clear here. I don't think, I'm just going to shoot straight with you guys, okay, like I always do, but here's the Bible. Here's my observation of people who teach the Bible sometimes. Sometimes people use this passage to do a whole sermon on the topic of divorce. I don't think that's the main point of this passage, broad teaching on divorce. I think the main point of this passage is the flippant attitude these men in particular at this time had towards their relationships in light of who they were running off to. There are broader principles we can draw out of this. I want you to see here that the idea is that instead of doing violence, the job is to protect. That's what God is saying through this passage here. There's this flippant attitude. The call is to protect, and these men have been apathetic in their relationship, which in God's eyes equates to hate and to violence. The question God is bringing forward to these husbands, at the core of it is, have I not been faithful to you? And yet you choose to be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. I mean, he is just hammering and hammering and hammering on this point. And it's because he desires good for his name amongst the nations, and he desires good for these people. He's saying, if you do this, here's the reality. If you'll run away quickly from the wife of your youth to these Babylonian women, the likelihood is that when you get bored with them, you'll run on to the next one. And then from there, you'll run on to the next one. And you are breeding into yourself a heart of unfaithfulness. And God is saying that is not who you are and not who I desire you to be. He ends this section. It says, you have wearied the Lord with your words. How have we wearied him, you ask? By saying all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord, and he is pleased with them. Or where is the God of justice? Now, like I said, next week we're going to go into this pivot where God talks about the reality of bringing hope and redemption through the Messiah. But I want you to see, just in this section, there's like this focus on how people have been unfaithful through their flippant attitude towards marriage. But then he adds on this reality that people have been flippant through their injustice. God isn't like, this is the only area where you're messing up. He's also saying, you guys have not been just. And that is also a reflection on me. Again, let's just shoot straight here. We live in a world today where people talk a lot about justice. And that's a good thing. The question we have to ask is, what does biblical, Christ-centered justice actually look like? Because the truth is, in our world today, you can say a couple key words and people will be like, yeah, you're on the side of fill in the blank. But it's a different thing when it costs you to carry out justice. Let me note here that this idea of they bring all these words to God. God says, I am wearied by your words. Like, he doesn't just say they're not sincere. He's like, I am wearied. I don't know the last situation you were in where you were wearied. But that word implies like it's been like droning noise that makes me tired. It's behavior or activity that's just going on and on and on. And now I'm just like, I'm spent, right? For me, I'm not a big fan of painting. I'm good at it for like 8 minutes. And then I'm just like, as long as there's a different color sort of on the wall, we're good, right? I remember one time when we lived out in Nottingham, we had to paint, and we were painting the ceilings, which is, for me, the most uncomfortable thing because you're like this the whole time, right? And they had put strapping on the ceilings where you would normally seal the drywall together. So there's these strips of wood this way and strips of wood this way. And they're about 1.5 inches wide, and they're like 1/16 of an inch deep. So you have to find a way to paint this tiny little side, right? So I painted the entire ceiling one day after work. Got home to the other house we were staying in while we were painting this one, midnight. The next day I go back to continue painting the other spots. So I go to take off the tape. I didn't take off the tape that night, which means the paint stuck to the tape, which means all the painting I did of this 1/16 of an inch spot was ripped off as I took the tape off. It took all my strength to try to contain some sense of holiness in that moment. I was so wearied by it. I was just like, I put in all this time and effort and I got nothing to show for it. And God is like, I am wearied by you. I am wearied, God says, by your words. And then they're like, what are you talking about? He says, you say all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord. He's pleased with them. Or where is this God of justice? People are now identifying things that are not just as just. And God is like, you're exhausting me with that. And then beyond that, they say, where is the God of justice? So they're doing things that are wrong. And they're also, when things don't go their way, they're going, God, where are you? Which again is this childish response. I want you to see here that God is a God who calls for us to live rightly because he's ordained the world to operate in a certain way. This is not God being like, today I think the rules are this. He's like, I've set up the system, and within the system, here's how to best operate to flourish. And when you live in justice, you will flourish. And when you promote injustice, you will bring harm. And God says, I want justice in the world, and you are failing to do so. There are some times when you read a text as you're prepping a sermon, and you're like, okay, here's the direct application. There's other times when you read it, and you go, all right, what do I do about this? I read that, and I thought to myself, how do we as Mercy Church be a people that push holy, gospel-centered justice forward? My answer to you right now is I'm not sure. But what I can tell you is that from the text, God values justice. What I can also tell you confidently is that even if we as a body don't know how to do it yet, individually, we can live more just lives. When God talks about justice, he's often talking about the caring for others. He's rarely talking about, I deserve justice. Not that that's not true, but when he talks about justice scripturally, he's often talking about how we serve and care for those who can't receive justice on their own. What does it look like for Mercy Church to be a people who will push forward, even sacrificially, the reality of justice in this world? I don't have an answer, but that's an area that we will have to lean into, that we'll have to dig into. Notice in this last line, it says, all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord, and he's pleased with them. And again, we see spiritual blindness of the people here. They are calling up, down, and down, up. And so God, over these 3 chapters, has basically brought a question or essentially convicting words to the people to say, I know you guys are asking questions, but I'm just going to tell you, here's how it is. Oh, you brought this up? Okay, here's how it is. Oh, here's another issue. Here's how it is. He's just laying into them. And at this point, it seems like the people are going, wait, what do you mean? So as we close this portion of Malachi, and again, next week, pivot to the hope he brings, let me just ask us the question, are we willing to engage with the hard stuff? Because at the beginning of the book, it started and God said, I love you. When God calls things out in our lives, it's not because he has nothing else to do and he's bored. It's not because he's unkind. It's because he's a loving father who looks and goes, I see darkness leaking in there, and we want to plug that hole up. We don't want more darkness. We want more light. We don't want more evil. We want more good. We don't want hatred. We want love. And so I'm going to point these things out, and he lays before the people, what will you do in response to that? And so to you and me, I ask the question, what will we do in response to what we've heard in Malachi so far about what God desires for our lives to look like? My challenge is that we would be courageous and know that God will meet us as we're willing to lean into the hard spaces because he has good for us. This is the God who says, I love you.